Here are 9 steps for getting deliberate practice in Spanish. Deliberate practice is not the same as just practice. It's the type of practice that gets you confident step by step until you're ready for anything in a real Spanish conversation. And speaking of conversation, let's start with step 9, which is to get real face-to-face practice out in the wild. So obviously, the simplest way to get practice is just to speak Spanish in real conversations. But here's how you can get deliberate practice while you're doing it. Give special attention to one specific component of Spanish that you're having trouble with. Try to improve that specifically, even in the middle of a conversation. For example, let's say you're having trouble with ser and estar. So you'll get out there and you'll have a random conversation, maybe with your Spanish-speaking in-laws. But while you do, pay special attention to how they use ser and estar. And also pay close attention to your own use of ser and estar and try to get it right. Remind yourself that it's okay to make mistakes in a Spanish conversation, but right now you're trying to get ser and estar right, just for this one conversation. This way you're getting targeted, deliberate practice on one aspect of the language, even in just a random, casual conversation. Of course, there is a problem. In this conversation, your Spanish-speaking in-laws probably aren't aware that you're focused on ser and estar. So they're not really going to be able to help you get the best possible practice with those verbs. So there's a step that should come before this, step number 8. And that's getting deliberate practice face-to-face with someone who's in on it. In other words, this person knows what you're practicing and they'll steer you toward that in the conversation. So for step number 8, you'll get into a conversation with your Spanish teacher or coach. And you can talk about any topic like the weather or what you did this weekend. But while you do, they're going to guide you toward those things that they know you're trying to get deliberate practice with. So if you're working on ser and estar, your coach is going to throw in a lot of uses of ser and estar. Or they might even specifically ask you questions that will require you to use the right verb. And if you have a good coach, they're going to be able to do this in a natural, organic way in the middle of the conversation. This makes it a natural progression towards step number 9, which is practicing natural conversation with someone who's not your coach. Here's why step number 8 is so valuable. Conversation is like a dance. When you jump into a Spanish conversation, it's like you're improvising a partner dance to a song that you've never heard before. You're working together with someone else and reacting in real time to whatever happens. But here's why that analogy is important. So let's imagine that you're trying to learn a new step in dance, maybe a particular spin. One option is you could practice that with a random stranger, but it's much more productive to practice it with a dance teacher, even if you're out on the dance floor. So you're practicing it with your teacher and they're specifically trying to help you in real time. If you get out on the dance floor with your teacher who knows that you're practicing this move, they can help make sure that you're getting it right before you try it with someone else. So that's step number 8. But of course, if you're practicing a new dance move for the first time, you're probably not doing it out on the dance floor. Instead, you would work on it in private with your teacher in a safe space until you understand it really well. And that brings us to step number 7, which is to get deliberate face-to-face practice, but not in the middle of a conversation. Using the dance analogy, if you're trying to learn a particular spin, you probably shouldn't do it on the dance floor. Instead, you should isolate it and practice it with your teacher. It's the same thing with ser versus estar. So yes, you eventually want to use these verbs naturally in a real conversation. But first, you need to make sure that you can use them correctly even in an individual sentence. So maybe your teacher will drill you by presenting you a few sentences in English and you're supposed to translate them into Spanish using the right verb. For example, my friends are ready, or my mom's dogs are smart. Your teacher presents these sentences to you and asks you to say the Spanish face to face on the fly. This helps prepare you to do things like this in a free-flowing conversation, so it's a very crucial step. But most Spanish learners skip this step. Maybe they sit down and they study ser and estar, but then they go straight from studying it in theory to jumping into a whole conversation. If you do this, you're missing out on a crucial bridge between studying and speaking. That's why steps number 7 and number 8 are so valuable. They help you turn theory into active skills with a lot more confidence. This means that when you get to step 9, which is having conversations in the wild with Spanish speakers in your life, you'll actually be ready for it. But of course, at some point you do have to sit down and study, not just practice face-to-face. So let's talk about how to make your study time as productive as possible using the step that comes before this. That's step number 6, which is to practice Spanish out loud on your own, but speaking as much variety as you can. So when you're studying Spanish on your own, you can say spontaneous Spanish sentences and try to make as much variety as you can, specifically focused on what you need to practice. This is different from just memorizing phrases. We're talking about creating variations so that your mind is ready to come up with variations on the fly face-to-face. Here's a fun way to do this. So let's say that you're working on ser versus estar. Your study materials might include sentences like these. My friend is at the house. Mi amigo está en la casa. My cat is very smart. Mi gato es muy listo. Now, most Spanish learners would just try to memorize these sentences the way that they are. But instead, you can make this into a little game. Imagine yourself in different conversations and try to vary these sentences a little bit to fit the conversations. So for example, imagine that you're talking with your friend about your pets and where they are and what they're doing. Here are some sentences that use both ser and estar in ways you might want to practice. Mi gato está conmigo porque quiere comida. Es muy listo. Mi perro está debajo del sofá, pero también quiere comida. No es muy listo. So that's one fun variation you might come up with. But now, to get even more practice with these structures, let's change the topic. Let's say we're instead talking about your family. Mis padres están en una fiesta. Son muy sociables. Mi hermano está jugando videojuegos. Es más introvertido. Mi hermana y yo estamos en el gimnasio. Somos muy activos. So when you do things like this, you're not just reciting Spanish, you're actually using it to express your own ideas. And you're still focused on the things you're trying to master, like ser and estar, but you're doing it in a more spontaneous way. This is a great step for deliberate practice. You're doing targeted, personalized work that prepares you for the next step, which is, of course, using those skills face-to-face. And that's why step number 6 is such an important bridge. By speaking Spanish on your own, but with these spontaneous variations, you're getting your brain used to generating Spanish in new and interesting ways, but in a safe, low-stakes environment. That way, when you sit down with your teacher for step number 7, you'll be ready for that kind of FaceTime interaction. But before you can just practice speaking spontaneously using sentence variations like that, you should, of course, make sure you can actually speak Spanish out loud without reading it. So that brings us to step 5, which is to drill yourself in speaking Spanish sentences from memory. Most Spanish learners never actually do this. They'll just study a bunch of Spanish that they read, and then they try to jump straight from that to face-to-face conversations. So then, of course, they get frustrated when the words don't flow. The missing link here is being able to produce a Spanish sentence when you can't lean on reading it right in front of you. Here's how you might make that work if you're working on ser versus estar. Maybe your study materials that you're looking at include sentences like these. So what you'll do in step number 5 is not just read them, you'll practice saying them out loud while not looking at them. So you look away from the screen or your page or whatever it is, maybe you look out the window or across the room. And while you do, you say, Mi gato es muy listo. This kind of practice is really powerful. When you can say Spanish sentences without looking, this means that your brain is making new connections. When you can speak Spanish out loud without looking, you're forcing your brain to think about Spanish in larger chunks at once. Think of it kind of like training wheels. So when you're learning to ride a bike, you eventually have to take the training wheels off. Reading a Spanish sentence that's written out in front of you is a good start, but eventually you have to get to the point that you can speak from memory. And yes, that's harder work, speaking Spanish when you're not looking at it, but that's the exact type of work we need to do in order to get into conversations. Of course, you can't get there overnight. There is work to do beforehand. And that brings us to step 4. Before you can say Spanish out loud from memory in step 5, you first need to be able to say Spanish out loud in the first place. So step 4 is to say Spanish out loud even when you're looking at the text. And that may seem simple, but once again, most Spanish learners skip this step. Most of the time, Spanish students will read sentences in front of them without saying them out loud. But this is a crucial piece of learning. Language learning isn't just a matter of thinking Spanish in your head. It's a physical skill that requires building the muscle memory of saying Spanish sounds out loud. So going back to this example from ser and estar, if you see the sentence, Mi gato es muy listo. Instead of just reading this, you say it out loud. You might say it multiple times, maybe even exaggerate the rhythm. Mi gato es muy listo. You might repeat any tricky parts slowly. The point is to train your brain and your mouth to work together on Spanish. This way, you build the muscle memory that you need for fluent speech. This kind of practice actually activates more of your brain because you're not just seeing and identifying Spanish, you're saying it physically. Plus, when you speak Spanish out loud, you're reinforcing pronunciation, word order, grammar, and vocabulary all at the same time. But all of that depends on step 3, which is to learn Spanish in entire sentences, not just individual words. A lot of Spanish learners who are just starting out focus on learning individual words and maybe some verb forms, but they don't focus enough on sentence structure. But sentence structure is the #1 thing that makes Spanish different from English. Putting words together in Spanish into full sentences works differently than it does in English. So if you start by just learning individual Spanish words, and then you try to stick them together into Spanish sentences, you aren't really learning Spanish. Spanish sentence structure is the glue that holds Spanish together and makes it flow. You should instead learn Spanish in sentence templates. Here's an example. Let's look at this English sentence. She is not my friend, but he is. You might be tempted to translate this literally word for word. So you'd say something like, Ella es no mi amiga, pero él es. But a Spanish speaker would actually say both halves of the sentence differently. Ella no es mi amiga, pero él lo es. So in Spanish, the no always comes before the verb, and then the word lo is necessary in structures like this. These are both very, very common patterns in everyday speech, and they're second nature to all native Spanish speakers. Of course, if you're learning Spanish as a second language, you have to do some work to make this grammar flow naturally. But once you understand this sentence and why it's put together the way it is, you can use it as a sentence template. This is super important for helping you get to step 6 and beyond, where you're creating your own Spanish sentences on the fly. As an example, here are some ways you might modify this structure. We're using the same sentence structure, but we're switching out the words and the meanings, which is fun. Once you learn Spanish sentence templates like this, you can plug in new meanings over and over, just like a native Spanish speaker does. This means that by learning Spanish sentence structures, you can start to express whole ideas with just a few moving parts. But of course, those moving parts also have to be solid. In order to do this step, you need to really know your Spanish vocabulary, so that brings us to step number 2. Step 2 is learning Spanish words in a way that you'll actually remember them. Most Spanish learners think that they're learning Spanish, but what they're actually doing is just reading vocabulary lists over and over. Maybe you listen to Spanish podcasts multiple times, or you reread lists, or you rewatch lessons over and over. And even though you spend lots of time on it, you're wondering, why is nothing sticking? Well, this is like pouring water into a leaky bucket. So sure, you're putting in the time, you might feel like you're working hard, but if the way that you're learning isn't helping you retain it, then all of that effort just leaks out. If this happens to you, you might just assume you're bad at learning languages, but that's not true. The truth is, you're just using the wrong study techniques. So instead of trying to learn words just by absorbing things passively, you need to use strategic memory hacks. These are methods that are actually designed for long-term memory. One of our favorites is called the testing effect. When you learn a new Spanish word, don't just nod and move along. Instead, quiz yourself to help remember it. A simple way to do this is with flashcards. So quiz yourself by shuffling up your Spanish vocabulary and then guessing the English from the Spanish. By forcing yourself to guess, you're doing deliberate practice with your Spanish words, and that's what makes it stick. Our free course at SpanishVideoCourse.com has tens of thousands of flashcards to help you learn and practice the top 1,000 words in Spanish. The main point here is that if you're not remembering what you study, then your practice isn't actually working. You can only become fluent in Spanish if your brain can remember what you've learned on demand. And that's why step 2 is to use methods of learning that will help you actually remember the words that you're learning. But of course, steps 2 through 9 are worth nothing if you don't start with step number 1, which is to learn the right words. If you don't learn the most important words in Spanish, steps 2 through 9 won't matter at all. So step number 1 is to focus all of your practice on the right vocabulary. Start with the most common foundational words that Spanish speakers actually use every day. If you're doing what most Spanish learners do and just learning lots of words like apple or bird or sky, you might be wondering why all those words aren't helping you have a simple conversation. Well, it's because most of these words actually have nothing to do with everyday expression in Spanish. If you actually want to speak Spanish fluently, you need to start with the small group of words that Spanish speakers use constantly. Believe it or not, there are just 100 words that make up over 50% of all words spoken in everyday Spanish. Or if you learn the top 500 words in Spanish, you'll be covering 75% of everything you hear and say in real life. There is a catch though. So these words are common, but they're also kind of tricky. The top 100 words include words like lo, se, le, te, que, and ya. And these words don't really have direct translations into English. So that's why most learners avoid these words at first. But if you want to be fluent in Spanish, these are the words that you should start with. If you do start with these words, you'll be practicing them so much that they'll become second nature sooner, which means you'll reach fluency much faster. So as you can see, all 9 steps build on each other. It all starts with learning the right words like ser, estar, and other high-frequency words. And then it's not just what you learn, it's how you learn it. So we use deliberate practice techniques that'll actually help you remember long-term. Then you'll learn these words inside sentence templates, so you're building real structures in Spanish, not just collecting isolated vocabulary. Then you'll practice these sentences out loud, first while reading them, then without looking, and then while creating variations on the sentences. That prepares you to start using those sentences face to face, first in drills with your teacher, then in natural conversations with your teacher, and eventually in fully spontaneous conversations out in the wild. Each step prepares you for the next one. And if you follow these in order, you're sure to reach fluency one step at a time through deliberate practice. To start following these steps in order right now, check out our free course at SpanishVideoCourse.com. It starts by walking you through the top 100 words in Spanish, showing you how to use them in real sentence templates, and giving you deliberate practice that actually sticks. Everything we talked about in this video is built right into the course. And make sure to subscribe to this channel for more study hacks that'll get you speaking Spanish fluently faster than ever.